Good day, everyone. Welcome to this introduction to Islam and in the latter parts on spirit and nature in Islam. In the first part of this video, I'll give a general overview of the history of Islam from its origins to the present day, such as you would find in any textbook on world religions. I'll be using both World Religions Today by Esposito, Fashing, and Lewis for this one, as well as Malloy's textbook, Experiencing the World's Religions. After that, we'll be covering Richard C. Foltz's article, Islam, from the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Ecology, followed by Nasser's chapter on his Religion and the Order of Nature, which will provide a review of order and nature across the world religions before transitioning in the end of his chapter to spirit and nature in Islam. The historical context for the emergence of Islam is that between the 5th and the 8th centuries, the Roman Empire had converted to Christianity and its center of power had migrated from west to east, the Byzantine Empire. Alexandria and Athens were centers of philosophy, Simplicius being the last great pagan Platonist, and Philoponus, the last Christian to take Aristotle seriously for a while. Around this time, in the deserts of Arabia or modern-day Saudi Arabia, the angel Gabriel revealed the Qur'an to Muhammad by direct revelation from Allah. Muhammad consolidated the Arabian world and Islam expanded. A multi-ethnic empire arose and the Muslim religion was born and established itself in all areas of human inquiry and endeavor, all Muslims believing that Muhammad is the final prophet in a lineage that stretches from Abraham through Jesus to Muhammad himself, the last prophet. Basic beliefs of Islam include the belief in a single, all-powerful, all-knowing, benevolent God who created and sustains the universe, the belief that each human has an individual, immortal soul, and the belief that God established laws for humans to follow. Major differences from Christianity we'll cover in more detail include that prophets are not divine, hence Jesus was not a God-man, but rather messengers of God's truth. The basic credo of Islam, there is no God but God, Muhammad is the messenger of God, as well as the principle of Tawhid, that God is one and absolute unity. Islam also rejects the Christian doctrine stemming from the Nicene Creed of the Holy Trinity. They see the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as a remnant of polytheism. The core teachings of Islam are found in the Qur'an, which presents the universal and primordial faith of all the prophets, from Adam to Muhammad. The Qur'an is the principal revealed document, and anyone who believes in it and follows its teaching has faith in the one sovereign Lord, creator and sustainer of all things, Allah, the same God, Abraham. According to Muslims, Islam is God's eternal way for the universe, but it must be a choice. Muslim means one who submits to God in the context of Ummah, that is, the Muslim community. The Shahada, or profession of faith, expanding on the credo just a little bit, I bear witness that there is no God except God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. You can convert to Islam when you say the Shahada in front of two witnesses. Now, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are all Abrahamic faiths rooted in the Old Testament or Torah. They all believe that God is the creator, sustainer, and ruler of the universe, and they all believe in angels, Satan, prophets, revelation, moral accountability, divine judgment, reward, and punishment. The roots of all the other differences get going in the way that Islam and Muslims trace their genealogy in the context of the Old Testament. Spiritually and mythologically, although we're not sure if there's any elements here of historical truth, Muslims trace their roots back to Ibrahim, or Ishmael, the firstborn son of Hagar to Abraham, who was Sarah's Egyptian servant. In fact, in the famous tale of Abraham and Isaac, Muslims believe that it was in fact Ishmael, Abraham's illegitimate son, which God asked Abraham to sacrifice as a proof of faith. Today, Islam is the second largest religion after Christianity, with 1.5 billion followers as compared to Christianity's 1.8 billion followers. So they're both equally large religions. A common misunderstanding of all Muslims is to say, oh, the Arabs. But most Muslims are not Arabs in Europe, Africa, and Asia Minor over the last 1,000 years. Actually, today, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country. The biggest story of Islam in the last 500 years is its encounter with Western European modernity. The early expansion and success of Islam was seen as a sign of God's guidance and pleasure. But by the 19th century, Europeans had colonized many Muslim areas. Muslims found themselves on the defensive against European imperialism. And during this period, modernist reformers emphasized the compatibility of Islam with reason, modern science, technology. In fact, the West would not have had a scientific revolution if it had not been for the recovery of ancient Greek scientific treatises through the Muslim world, as well as the influence of Islamic philosophers, beginning in the early Renaissance. Today, Islam still presents itself by and large as an alternative path to Western social order, that is, to capitalism, communism, or socialism. Progressive and modernist elements in Islam received a bit of a setback with Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979, which signaled a resurgence of Islam in Muslim politics globally. Most Western nations now have large Muslim minorities, and Islam is currently on the path to replace Judaism as the second largest religion in America. In order to understand what Islam is in our contemporary world, we have to first learn about the history and development of Islam in the earliest Muslims community and trace their story to the present day. So let's do that now. Who was the Prophet Muhammad? He was the final prophet, according to Islamic tradition, and an orphan raised in the desert. Born around 570 CE and dying around 632 CE, he was born in Mecca, in what is today Saudi Arabia. The Arabian desert tribes at this time practiced tribal polytheism, and Mecca was a thriving commercial town, reflecting many different tribal faiths as well as religions prevalent in the region, such as Judaism and even some Christians, as well as Zoroastrians. Their local practices worshipped tree and mountain spirits, gods, and the jinni, the origin of the English word genie, capricious spirits thought to inhabit the desert and even to enter people. The supreme god, Al-Ilah or Allah, was an object of faith but not of worship, and associated with Allah at this time were three goddesses, daughters of Allah, Al-Lat, Manat, and Al-Uzi, goddesses related to nature, the moon, and fertility. All the tribal gods, Allah and others, were worshipped with individual shrines within the Kaaba or cube, which housed the idols of 360 tribal gods. According to Islamic historians, this was a period with little sense of moral responsibility beyond tribal family and honor, and so it's referred to as the period of ignorance. It is Muhammad's received revelation, the Qur'an, and its recitation, which brings knowledge and dispels ignorance, as well as the study of the Hadiths or recollections or narratives about the life of Muhammad. Muhammad's full name was Muhammad ibn Abdullah, a preacher, a teacher, a political leader, a merchant, a judge, soldier, diplomat, ideal husband, father, and friend. And for Muslims, Muhammad is a guide in every aspect of life. The question is always, what would Muhammad do? There's a lack of consensus over how to spell certain names or words in contemporary scholarship on the subject, so sometimes you'll find Kaaba spelled like this, or like this, or like this. In any case, the Kaaba was a haram or extremely sacred place where no one or thing could be harmed, and so was in a way responsible for a delicate unity among the tribal peoples of Arabia and the center of their practice of peace. Myth has it that the Kaaba was originally established by Abraham and Ishmael. Muhammad himself was born into the Quraysh tribe, which dominated Meccan economy at the time, and among the tribes some were more pious or Hanifs and tended to temper their tribal deities with an ethical monotheism with Jewish and Christian influences. Here you see a map of the most significant sites in the history of Islam. Here is where Muhammad lived most of his life, Mecca. There, Medina or Yathrib, more about in a moment. And the third sacred city for Islam is Jerusalem, over here. So Muhammad was an orphan, a poor cousin raised by his uncle in the Quraysh tribe and employed in the caravan business. He had one older wife for 28 years, Khadijah. Although many younger wives after her death, much is portrayed about their ideal relationship. They were closest confidants, she was his strongest supporter, and they're said to have had 6 children. At the age of 30, Muhammad was quite prominent in Meccan society and nicknamed Al-Amin, or the trustworthy or the faithful. He would often retreat to Mount Hira, where he received a call to be God's messenger, probably around the age of 42. At first, Muhammad wasn't sure which sort of angel or demon had spoke to him in the cave. At first, he thought he might be going mad, but the presence was too bright, and he determined that it was the angel Gabriel, who commanded him to pen the first words of the Qur'an. Recite in the name of your Lord who has created man out of a germ cell. Recite, for your Lord is the most generous one, who has taught by the pen, taught man what he did not know. And when further revelations came to him, Muhammad began to share them with his closest friends and family members, particularly his wife, cousin, and friend Abu Bakr. These were the first Muslims. The first recorded revelation is in itself a fascinating piece of philosophical poetry, emphasizing some sense of the biology of man, maybe a germ cell, or in other translations, a clot of blood, and also the task for man to write or sing by the pen to understand the ways of nature and of God. Muhammad is said to have written every chapter in the Qur'an, although it's being brought together and collated into the final form we have now, occurred only in the generations after his death. It is considered by Muslims to be the literal word of God. It's written in Arabic and consists of 114 chapters or surahs, arranged from longest to shortest chapter. Since some of the earliest revelations to Muhammad were indeed quite short chapters, those are often found at the end. Although within this organization from longest to shortest, it can be a bit difficult to trace the chronology of which chapters were written before or after. It is considered the final revelation in a long series of biblical prophets and books from the Torah to Injil, the Evangel or Gospel, and it portrays Muhammad as a warner from God who admonishes repentance and obedience where the final judgment is near. Muhammad received revelations for more than 2 decades. At first quite private, he became vocal in denouncing polytheism and religious control in Mecca by the tribes. Throughout the Qur'an, we find a strong social justice message. Don't exploit the poor, orphans, widows, no usury. Loyalty is owed to Allah alone and not the tribal gods. Before long, there were some persecutions. The Meccans thought he wanted them to abandon their traditions, and he did. He was put in some physical danger, and him and his earliest followers migrated to other lands. Around the time of initial persecution, Muhammad is said to have experienced one of his greatest visions, or the mirage, the night journey. This is actually where we get the term mirage from. This was a very sacred dream in which Muhammad journeyed to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem with the assistance of Gabriel and ascended through the 7 heavens. At each heaven, Muhammad met a former prophet or special figure in the Old and the New Testament. And the significance of this trip was that it was a miraculous event which showed that God supported Muhammad and the Muslim community. The combination of persecution and the mirage led to the Hijra, which we'll talk about in a minute. The basic teachings of the Qur'an are the oneness of God, the reality of prophecy, the day of judgment and the afterlife, and also the importance of angels. Angels are also important in Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. The centrality of angels in Islam, you could say, is greater than in the other 2 Abrahamic faiths. Allah himself often speaking through the angel, and the angel mediating Allah's message and meaning to man. Arabic is a very beautiful language to listen to, but in written form, it's probably the most beautiful script the world has. Calligraphy developed as a very important art form in Muslim culture. This is partly because of widespread prohibition against idols and image making. So although there are many illustrations of Muslim art, they are in second place in regard to the beautiful calligraphy that decorates the pages of the Quran, mosques, and many things. The fluid form of this writing is suggested nicely by the French word arabesque, which has entered the English language to describe a pattern of interlacing lines that are curving and graceful. Because Arabic is an especially beautiful language, chanting the Quran is an art form, and some chanters have become famous for the beauty of their voices and interpretation of Quranic material. Many of the surahs of the Quran have very evocative titles like the elephant, light, dawn, thunder, the cave, smoke, the mountain, the moon, the high one. Other than the Quran, the other sacred texts of Islam include the Sunnah and the Hadith literatures. The Sunnah describing the way of life of Muhammad, and the Hadiths reports collected by Muhammad's companions about his life. After the period of Muhammad's failed preaching in Mecca and receiving of the Miraj came the period of the Hijra and the migration to Medina from Mecca. And accordingly, after 622, Muhammad becomes the founder of the Islamic community, Ummah, and this is the beginning of the Islamic calendar, AH, or after the Hijra. It seems that Muhammad did not intend to create a new religion, but rather to reform Arabian polytheism in light of Abrahamic faith. His emphasis was on absolute unity, Tawhid, the oneness of God, and of God's final revelation through him as prophet. Polytheism and idolatry were condemned and suppressed, and accordingly, most Muslims tend to believe the teachings of Moses and Jesus were distorted by authors, editors, in idolatrous directions. We must find again the straight path, or Sharia, and the message of God given by Muhammad. After founding the Islamic community in Yathrib, it grew substantially, and there were many individual battles with the Meccans, some won by Muhammad and his followers and some by them. The Battle of Badr is particularly important mythologically because the Muslims won against overwhelming odds, this demonstrating God's favor. There were many battles over years until eventually a truce was declared. Before long, however, Muhammad and his followers seized Mecca in 630, and Muhammad is said to have been at this point merciful, granting amnesty to the Meccans and enforcing their conversion to Islam. Once Mecca had been taken for Islam, Muhammad rededicated the pilgrimage to Kaaba in Mecca to Allah alone, purging the Kaaba of its 360 idols. Here you see the Kaaba today, a cubical building in Mecca that measures about 30 feet by 30 feet. This is still the most important pilgrimage site in contemporary Islam. In theory, every Muslim being expected to make the pilgrimage to the Kaaba at least once in their life, and this is known as the Hajj. Again, the Hijra marks the beginning of communal life under Islam and Islamic history and its calendar, as well as the notion within Islam of the theocratic state, led by a prophet who is believed to be guided by a divine scripture. Here you see some more details on the various battles fought between the early Muslims and the Meccans. It seems that Muhammad continued to live in Yathrib, now Medina, city of the Prophet, until his death 10 years later in 632 CE. After his death, questions arose about the leadership of the Muslim movement. The Sunni, the majority who follow Sunnah traditions, did not believe that Muhammad had chosen a successor. This is the moment of a crisis. Who should lead now that Muhammad has died? Should it be Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, or Ali? The Shia faction of Islam believed that Muhammad had appointed his son-in-law Ali as successor. And this crisis became a permanent rift, his first successor in fact becoming his friend Abu Bakr, who acts on behalf of Muhammad, Khalifa, and is thus a caliph or religious leader, hence the term caliphate. Umar ibn al-Khattab initiated a period of expansion, conquest, and during the reign of the third caliph, there were a series of rebellions that would plague the Islamic community's development. The most important crisis of leadership occurred during the reign of the fourth caliph, Ali. Passed over as the first successor but becoming the fourth one, Ali was the Prophet's cousin as well as son-in-law, having married Fatima, a daughter of Muhammad and Khadijah. But shortly after Ali's accession to power, Muhammad's younger widow Aisha and the daughter of Abu Bakr challenged his authority. This was followed by rebellion and arbitration, which proved indecisive and has lasted to the present day. Ali's followers, known as the Kharajites, are those who go out or secede. Meanwhile, the mainstream or Sunni Islam under Muawiyah seized Syria and established the Umayyad dynasty. It was predominantly responsible for the rapid spread of Islam from there. During this period, the followers of Ali emerged as revolutionaries within the new Islamic empire, much like contemporary radical extremists today, seeing themselves as God's righteous army, tasked with completing the battle against the usurpers of God's rule. The opposition of these groups, Umayyad Empire, leading to the split of Islam into two distinct communities, Sunni and Shia, Shia meaning the minority, or partisans of Ali. The Shia's minority status resulted in discrimination against them through the centuries, but the Shia faction survived in various communities, eventually morphing into the nation-state of Iran as a majority Shia state. Today, Sunni Muslims constitute 85% and Shia about 15% of the global Islamic population. They continue to agree on a great many things, but also have smaller and more major differences. The most significant being that in Shia Islam, the imam or leader must be a direct descendant of the Prophet's family. The Sunni caliph is only a political and military leader of the community, tasked to ask and speak on behalf of the Prophet, and yet is not a prophet himself. Nor is the Shia imam a prophet, but he is considered divinely inspired, sinless, infallible, and the final authoritative interpreter of God's will as formulated in Sharia law. The history of the spread of Islam and creation of the Islamic Empire becomes very complicated after this point. The two most important early Islamic empires are the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid Empire. The most important later medieval to modern empires include the Ottomans, the Mongols, and the Safavids, respectively ruling in the Mediterranean, South Asia, and Central Asia. During the period of the rise and spread of Islam, the Byzantine Empire, ruling from Constantinople, was in a weakened state due to ongoing fighting with the Persian Empire, and these conditions helped Islam quickly expand their territories. Islamic armies took Syria in 635 CE and Persia in 636 CE, at which point they began to move west, taking control of Egypt in about 640 CE. This success was intoxicating. After the successful conquest of Spain or the Iberian Peninsula, Islam might well have continued to expand into France and Northern Europe, had it not been stopped in southern France by the Christian forces of Charles Martel, who was the grandfather of Charlemagne. The Battle of Tours is a major moment in this story. Just 100 years after the death of Muhammad, Islam had almost conquered Europe, the Battle of Tours becoming one of the defining battles of world history. Within early Islam, Jews were also considered people of the book and natural allies, and some elements of Islam adapt Jewish cultures. For example, the fast of Yom Kippur hovers in the background of the Islamic Ramadan. There was also some tension between early Islamic and Jewish communities, since Jews rejected the idea that the Qur'an was scripture and Muhammad a prophet. And soon the direction of prayer was also changed within Islam from Jerusalem to Mecca. According to Islam, God has sent 124,000 prophets. As stated in the Qur'an, there is not a nation, but that a warner has been sent to it. A prophet is one who conveys a message from God to a specific people at a specific time. What the messenger delivers is considered universally binding sacred law. In the Torah, Noah, Abraham, and Moses, and in the evangelical literatures, Jesus, are considered the chief prophets of power, Muhammad being the final prophet. And the Qur'an is both an original and final revelation. It's not thought to build upon these previous foundations and refer its authority to them, but rather to directly access a heavenly tablet and transcribe it from the origin of the world in Allah. On the subject of Jesus, Muslims give credence to stories about his miracles, his ability to heal the sick, feed the hungry, raise the dead, and to affirm God's power over human learning and wisdom. They even believe he was lifted up to heaven by God alone and will return to establish true Islam on earth. The power of Muhammad, however, exceeds that even of Jesus, since he is the prophet of the end of times and the seal of the prophets. His life example, or Sunnah, is the model to guide history, and his actions and sayings are divinely inspired. Respect is shown by adding peace and the blessings of God be upon him whenever Muhammad's name is spoken or written. Originally committed to memory and written down only later with variations marked, the Qur'an became an official text only by committee about 20 years after Muhammad's death, and it said that its order was determined by Muhammad at Gabriel's instructions. The tradition of commentary on the Qur'an is called Tafsir, or unveiling, and has three sources: the Hadith literatures and the opinions of Muhammad's companions and successors, or the Sunnah. There are many schools of interpretation. Common to them all is the Qur'anic Concept of God and the idea that it is a sin to associate any other being with God. Note in Christianity the huge literatures on the idea of a cardinal sin, whether it's pride, superbia, or gluttony, is a debate that stretches from Augustine to Aquinas. For Islam, the basic concept of sin or shirk rests in a misidentification of God. From this, all particular human iniquities would flow. Allah is the Lord of all beings, and his essence is unknowable, but God can be known through his attributes, and these are the most beautiful names. The attributes or epithets of gods are various names of Allah in Islam, and there are 99 of them, all very beautiful. God is God, other than whom there is no God, knower of the unknown and the visible. God is the all-merciful, the compassionate, the King, the Holy One, peace, the faithful, the guardian, the majestic, the compeller, the lofty one, and so on through the 99 names. The 5 pillars of Islam are to declare or bear witness that there is no God except God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God, to establish regular worship, to pay the zakat alms or charity, to observe the fast of Ramadan, and to perform the Hajj pilgrimage. All Muslims are supposed to pray 5 times a day at dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and after dusk. Salat also includes ritual washing, as well as calls to prayer, usually performed by a muezzin and always repeated at least twice. Prayer is very complicated in the Islamic tradition, with many different types of prayers, and also for very observant Muslims, deepening levels of prayers, as well as prescribed postures such as the masjid, from which we get the word mosque. The direction of prayer is known as the Qibla and is marked in a mosque by a niche, the mihrab, which is sometimes highly decorated with designs or Quranic verses, like this mihrab at a mosque in Cairo. Almsgiving, or zakat, charity. In most Muslim nations, 2.5% of accumulated wealth is supposed to be given to the poor. although it now has become more voluntary as income tax provides the same service. Giving, or the zakat, must be voluntary and is seen as a loan to God that will be repaid on the day of resurrection. The Ramadan feast is the next major pillar and is prescribed in this Quranic verse. It includes fasting from daybreak to sunset and abstaining from food, drink, smoking, sex, gossiping, lying, and anger. It's the time of a turn to God in prayer and meditation. There are exemptions for the sick, travelers, children, women who are pregnant, nursing, or menstruating. It lasts for a whole month and is based on the lunar calendar, so depending on when it falls in a given year, daybreak to sunset can be very short or very long and onerous indeed. Sometimes Ramadan falls in summer, sometimes in winter, and it ends with a 3-day festival of exchanging gifts. The next pillar is the pilgrimage to Mecca, or the Hajj, during which pilgrims wear white garments. Clothing for women isn't prescribed, but most women who do the Hajj today can be seen dressed in white like the men. Interestingly, women are not required to wear the veil while on Hajj. There are 2 Hajjs, the Lesser Hajj, which involves circumambulating the Kaaba 7 times and running between the 2 hills 7 times. This is thought to be a ritual commemorating Hagar's search for water for Ishmael. The Greater Hajj involves a much more detailed itinerary and series of rituals, often involving at the end a trip to the grave of the Prophet in Medina. On the subject of Islamic law or Sharia law, its main sources are the Qur'an and the Sunnah. A hadith must be traced back to an eyewitness and must have a chain to establish authenticity. There are 6 collections of hadiths. Sharia means the law of God and originally meant a way to the source of water. It encompasses God's plan for human society, and there are 5 categories to describe each human action. An action may be lawful, halal, that is obligatory, commendable, recommended, neutral, permitted, reprehensible, disliked, or unlawful, haram, forbidden. Sharia law first developed under the Umayyad dynasty in the 8th to 9th century CE, and it is based on the Qur'an and the Sunnah, giving examples, the hadiths reports, as well as qiyas or analogical reasonings by the jurists. For example, there is no material in the Qur'an, Sunnah, or hadiths that deal with psychedelics, so it is only from the jurists that Islam identifies them with alcohol. Thus, the current Iranian Ayatollah of Shia Islam has pronounced an edict against this particular qiyya and declared that entheogenic substances are not alcohol and thus permitted for research and use. Between the Quran, Sunnah, hadiths, and qiyyas, a general picture of the specifics and scope of Islamic law is developed, but it must also attain consensus of the learned and the Muslim community, the ijma. Early Islamic philosophy is based largely on the development of Islam and its encounter with Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle and Plato and the Neoplatonists. Islamic philosophers treat many of the same topics as do Western philosophers during similar periods. They discourse about God, free will, moral and religious obligations, the return of God, and the existence of God, the nature of creation, evil, and suffering. In another video I've put up on YouTube, I survey early Islamic philosophical theology in 24 minutes, and you can check that out. There are many major Islamic philosophers, but during the classical period of Islam, roughly beginning in 800 CE, or the 1st and 2nd centuries AH, we can point to Al-Kindi, who attempted to reconcile philosophy with Islam, to Al-Farabi, who argued that God is pure intellect, the highest good. The greatest Islamic philosopher is often said to be Avicenna or Ibn Sina, who clarified Aristotle's lecture notes and situated the Islamic faith within a basically Aristotelian theology with some major differences. And lastly, Al-Ghazali, who argued that true knowledge does not come through the senses nor rational science, but only comes through a divine light that God casts into one's heart. In Al-Ghazali, Islamic pietism, you could say, or the Sufi movement, becomes acceptable in the mainstream of Islam. For Westerners, the Sufi mystical tradition is often the most interesting aspect of Islam. Since Fitzgerald's translations of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, the 20th century has seen an enormous flourishing of interest in Sufi poetry, especially in Western New Age communities, where Hafiz and Rumi are often the only poets that people know. Early in the Sufi mystical tradition, there's also Rabia, who apparently was an extremely beautiful woman whose poetry uses erotic love to express devotion to Allah and is full of passion and spirituality. She remained single so as to devote her life to the love of God, and in one of her most famous sayings, "My Lord, If I worship you in fear of the fire, burn me in hell. If I worship you in desire for paradise, deprive me of it. But if I worship you in love of you, then deprive me not of your eternal beauty. Sufism can be described as a mystical life along the spiritual journey to God. It develops further in Ibn Arabi in terms of the unity of being, and Rumi's enormous poem cycle, the Mathnawi. It is in Al-Ghazali that the Sufi tradition becomes reconciled with official Islam to a large extent. He argued the Sufis were Muslims who pursued knowledge of God through practices designed to achieve a higher state of consciousness. Like many Christian mystics, early Sufis practiced rigorous asceticism, rejecting worldly things and looking inward to find God. Following a 12-year foray into Sufi asceticism, Al-Ghazali concludes that through sufficiently rigorous mystical practice, humans can, in fact, achieve an immediate experience of nearness to God, and that through this experience, we can learn things that cannot be expressed in words. Devotional practices of the Sufis include dhikr, remembrance of God, sama, hearing God's divine voice through the Qur'an and other poetry, as well as music and dance, such as in Mevlevi Sufism, from which we get the practice of whirling dervishes. This is thought to derive from the practice of Rumi himself. The Sufis commonly speak of the sense of loss of self, or fana, extinguishing of egoistic consciousness, and mystical absorption in the one God. This often flirted even with heresy, such as in Al-Hallaj, who publicly and repeatedly applied the name of God to himself, saying, "I am Al-Haq, the truth, the real reality itself." His comments were so shocking to some of his contemporaries that they executed him. Islam spread as a missionary religion, the message of Islam being considered for everyone, and it sees itself as part of the same scriptural tradition as Judaism and Christianity. Under Islam, Jews and Christians were considered dhimmi, or protected people, and were generally allowed to carry along their merry way so long as they paid their taxes. Later, all traditions that had sacred scriptures became protected under this term. Because Islam spread through military conquest and occupation, it was often seen by the medieval Christian world as the religion of the sword. Muslims began to move into North Africa in the second half of the 7th century. The capital of the Umayyad dynasty was Damascus, established in 661. The capital of the Abbasid Empire was in Baghdad, although it gradually shifted to Persian and later Asian territories, as well as further west to Tunisia and Cordoba in Spain. The history of Spain and Islam is particularly interesting. Muslims conquering the Iberian Peninsula in 711 CE, and major centers of learning being established in Cordoba and Toledo. Jews were welcome under Muslim rule, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, after facing severe restrictions under Christian rulers. And from 700 to around 1200 CE, we can speak of the golden age of Islam as one of mutual tolerance with many great cultural centers. The textbook covers the global spread of Islam and its different character in different regions in more detail, and I'll let you cover that for yourself. By the 13th century, the Ottoman Empire was established. In modern-day Turkey, that is, a routing of the Byzantine Empire, which was in part a reaction to Christian crusades, into the Islamic world, and resulted in a transformation of the city of Constantinople into Istanbul. Islam as well spread into China by the 13th century. Today, approximately 50 million Muslims live in China. Islamic presence in South Asia began as early as the 8th century. By the 14th century, most of India was under Muslim rule. However, the majority of people did not convert, and Islam had to coexist with a culture that remained largely polytheistic. Today, tensions and conflicts between Pakistan and India, and within India, trace their roots to these medieval historical events. Southeast Asia, there's no evidence of Islam before the 10th century, but after the 17th century, Islam becomes dominant in many of these regions, especially Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. Today, 1/3 of the world's Muslims live in Southeast Asia. In North America, there is some presence of the Islamic world before 1550, but at least 20% were slaves. The 20th century sees the establishment of the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, as well as alliances between Africana diasporic communities and Islam, such as in Malcolm X. The first mosque in America was founded in 1915 in Maine, and in Canada in 1938 in Edmonton. Alongside European-influenced Islamic modernism, the 18th century as well saw a rise in various forms of Islamic fundamentalism. Jihad, or struggle, is sometimes referred to as the sixth pillar of Islam, although it has no such official status. It refers, in the primary sense, to the duty of all Muslims to exert themselves so as to realize God's will and to fulfill the universal mission of Islam and its spread, to spread the Islamic community through converting others, or the missionary aspect. In most of the Islamic world, it's a term used to describe one's personal struggle to uphold the 5 pillars, to establish good schools, to clean up neighborhoods, and to work for social justice. It also includes, however, defense of Islam, perhaps in war. In theory, a jihad is not supposed to include aggressive warfare. Evoking jihad in this way, in a holy war, holy wars of conquest, begins early in the history of the spread of Islam, and contemporary extremists such as Osama bin Laden and ISIS, as well as other militant organizations in Lebanon, the Persian Gulf, and Indonesia, preach a more violent, defensive, or expansive form of jihad. So in the modern period, Islam becomes exceedingly complex, perhaps even more so than the history of Christianity and its subdivisions. Alongside modernism, there is an emphasis on fundamentalism or revivalism and reform. The question is always, what is the true Islam? How shall we return to the pristine Islam? In the Wahhabi movement, the classical Islamic world and the verdicts of legal scholars are often questioned. Culturally, the prohibition against idolatry is emphasized. There are various organizations and founders in the Islamic reform movement. And in more recent history, after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, there is as well the more modernist or progressive vision of Islam we find in the Arab Spring. The political complexities of Islam in the modern world are truly enormous. One thing needs underlining in a short intro like this. In fact, the vast majority of Muslims do not support the actions of extremist groups or rogue states within Islam. In a major Gallup organization world poll discovered that the vast majority of Muslims, 93%, believed that the attacks on the World Trade Center on 9/11 were not justified. Only 7% of the world Muslim community said that they were. Anyone who's followed an American presidential election and the competing values that make up our democracy would have to note that a landslide opinion poll like that speaks more about the global character of Islam than the xenophobic and ethnocentric prejudices of American media's constant misidentifying of Islam with extremism since 9/11 and through to the present day. The issue of the status of women in Islam is often a thorny problem, in particular Islamic nation states. On the whole, there continues to be power disparity in the Islamic family, men being allowed to have up to 4 wives, although this is seldom practiced, and there are Qur'anic verses which are against the practice in particular cases. What we must understand regarding the gender and marriage mores of early Islam in the Qur'an is the social context in which they were formed. Widowed women very often needing protection. Internationally, the hijab or veil has become a symbol of women's rights, but ever an ambiguous symbol since it emphasizes both freely chosen affirmation of Islamic identity for those who wear it, as well as limitation on women's rights where its wearing is enforced or banned by law, such as in the recent controversies in France. Often insufficiently highlighted, the Qur'an in fact produces new rights for women, and the Islamic world was far more gender egalitarian on the whole than the Christian one during the period of its evolution. Muhammad forbade infanticide, a common practice of the Arabian tribes at the time. He considered women and men to be equal in their basic rights, permitted divorce for various reasons, demanded that wives receive financial support in the event of divorce, and allowed remarriage for divorcees and widows, also affirming property rights for both men and women. Noteworthy is that the Quran does not itself demand the veiling. This is more a cultural norm in Islamic countries. There are also quite a few chauvinist and misogynistic statements in the Quran, such as good women are obedient and prescribing when women can be beaten for disobedience. And today, positions on the role of women in Islam are moving in 2 directions. In some countries, women receiving more extensive public education and veiling laws being laxed. And in some locations, women are seeking the right to act as leaders of the Friday prayers in the mosque. The history of reform, revivalist, fundamentalist, and extremist movements within Islam is very complex and covered more extensively in the textbook. The struggle for reform within Islam can take many different directions: religious, intellectual, spiritual, and moral. It always involves a complex process of reinterpretation and can be slowed in authoritarian regimes. As Esposito writes, in contrast to Christianity's centuries-long Protestant Reformation and Vatican II in Roman Catholicism, the forces of globalization and development today necessitate a more rapid process of change, and Muslims all over the world are called to exemplify the teachings of the Quran in a new context. A adapting them to the just and middle path of an upright community. The Quran states, "Thus we have made you a just community, that you may bear witness to humanity." And the straight path, the way of God, to whom belongs all that is in the heavens and all that is in the earth. Across its long history, the Muslim picture of the world, God, and of life can be summed up in answer to three basic questions. What is ultimate reality? How should we live? And what is our purpose in the world? For Islam, God is the creator and sustainer of the universe, the world, and all that is in it. Elements of the beautiful natural world are signs of God. Humans learn about ultimate reality through God's revelations, which are communicated to humanity through prophets. And the Quran is the source of God's teaching about the nature of ultimate reality and the nature of the world. In regards to how we should live in this world, Islam teaches that human beings are part of God's creation. People should worship God, be generous to the needy, and live righteously. The life of the Prophet Muhammad, especially as related in the Sunnah, serves as an example for how Muslims ought to live, and the 5 pillars of Islamic worship and practice are the foundations for how Muslims should live their faith. In regards to what our ultimate purpose is, Muslims believe in an afterlife and a day of judgment. Those who have lived righteously will enter paradise, and those who have led sinful lives will be cast into the fire. God will judge each person independently, and devout Muslims aim to live righteous lives by submitting to the will of God, adhering to the 5 pillars, and following the example of the Prophet Muhammad. Let's pivot now to an examination of environmental and ecological themes, conceptions of spirit and nature, and philosophies of nature in the Quran and the Islamic tradition. We can begin with 2 quotes on nature in the Quran. "And the earth have we spread forth, and thrown thereon the mountains, and caused everything to spring forth in it in balanced measure. Look upon the fruit thereof, when they bear fruit, and upon its ripening. Lo, herein verily are signs for a people who believe." The theme of nature is given and balanced by God, and as a realm of divine signs inspiring faith in Allah, are developed across the history of Islamic philosophy and theology, but perhaps nowhere more fervently than in the Sufi mystical tradition. As in this poem by Rumi, "The world is frozen, its name is inanimate, which means frozen, O Master. Wait till the rising sun of resurrection, that thou mayest see the movement of the world's body. Since God hath made man from dust, it behooves thee to recognize the real nature of every particle of the universe, that while from this aspect they are dead, from that aspect they are living, silent here but speaking yonder. They all cry, we are hearing and seeing and responsible through to you, the uninitiated, we are mute." Within a Western secular and scientific paradigm, it may often seem as if nature is merely mechanical. The spiritual dimensions of every aspect of nature as signs of Allah are here emphasized by the poet. Whatever seems dead to us now will appear as living, silent here but speaking yonder. We can only see nature as inanimate insofar as we are uninitiated. The incomprehensibility we experience leading to a muteness, which itself participates in the muteness of nature. But ultimately, nature is spirit, and we are a part of it both here and in the heaven of God. The main scholarly overview of the connection between Islam and ecology we'll be using is Richard C. Foltz, who sets out to examine Islamic traditions and their principles of valuing the natural world. Perhaps an infelicitous metaphor, Foltz begins from the metaphor of the two-edged sword, pointing on the one hand to development and economic growth within Islam, and on the other to Islamic environmental ethics. Islam is often viewed as a religion of social justice. Only recently has there been an emphasis on ecological dimensions. Unlike the other Abrahamic monotheisms, this trend within the scholarship is often framed as a response to Lynn White. Foltz points out that Islamic environmentalism is a narrower theme than Muslim environmentalism in general, since this is often secularly motivated, like in the West. And he notes that Islamic environmentalism is generally rooted in interpretations of the Qur'an and Sunnah or Hadith reports. We find some emphasis of it in the history of Sharia law since the Umayyad dynasty, and most relevant here is the Qur'anic concept of stewardship or successorship, the Khilafah. One way of interpreting Qur'anic stewardship is as humanity's vice-regency over nature and creation, which could be understood as a kind of test. Will the people of Allah relate to the environment well or poorly? If not well, we may not be worthy of Allah's grace. Of course, Islamic environmentalism and the valuation of nature is rooted again in the principle of Tawhid, the unity of God, or the unity of being, such as in Ibn Arabi. Like in Christianity and Judaism, while radical monotheism tends to be the rule, there are some strands of the Islamic philosophical and literary traditions which seem to underline pantheistic monism, understanding nature as God, according to the principle of Tawhid, or the unity of being. From the point of view of orthodoxy, this view has been criticized as shirk, that is, involving the cardinal sin of idolatry, in this case, idolatry of nature. But in support of a more inclusive interpretation of Tawhid, Folt cites the Islamic verse, which states that all creation praises God, even if this praise is not expressed in human language. The seven heavens and the earth and all therein praise him, and there is not a thing but hymns his praise. Lo, he is ever clement and forgiving. According to these verses, Muslim might mean one who submits to the natural laws of God. And all of nature and living things would be Muslim in this sense. Only human beings can choose to be or not to be Muslim. This seems quite close to Sally McFague's idea of the cosmic Christ. In Foltz's reading here, humans face a unique danger, but also a unique opportunity, since mainstream Islam considers our species alone can be rewarded with eternal life. Again, the Quran states, there is not an animal in the earth nor a flying creature on two wings, but they are people like unto you. And it describes Islam as the religion of fitra, the very nature of things. According to this doctrine of purity or essence, humans are considered to be Muslim by nature, though they can be distracted from this path of submission to the divine will. The Quran also frequently teaches compassion to non-human animals. If you kill, kill well. If you slaughter, slaughter well. Let each of you sharpen his blade and let him spare suffering to the animal. As well as, for charity shown to each creature which has a wet heart is alive, there is a reward. Some trees are as blessed as the Muslim himself, especially the palm. More ecological sayings of the Prophet. And when he turns away from you, his effort in the land is to make mischief therein and to destroy the crops and the cattle, and Allah loves not mischief. Do no mischief on the earth after it has been set in order. O children of Adam, look to your adornment at every place of worship, and eat and drink, but be not wasteful. Lo, he Allah loves not the wasteful. Live in this world as if you will live in it forever, and live for the next one as if you will die tomorrow. And when doomsday comes, if someone has a palm shoot in his hand, then he should plant it. You may recall another version of this statement we found in the early history of Judaism a few weeks ago. From these verses alone, it's pretty clear that Muhammad laid down what he considered nature to be in relation to Allah and human beings, and also that he may indeed have considered everything that exists to be Muslim, and that he advocated for care and compassion for all God's creatures, animal and vegetal. If so, then why is ecological environmentalism still a marginal approach in Islam today? Mustafa Abu Sway argues that the Hadith enjoining Muslims from relieving themselves on public pathways or in water sources can be understood as preventing pollution in the language of today. Foltz notes that Islam has not yet figured prominently in emerging discussions on religion and the environment. Rather, the same articles and faces keep appearing in anthologies and at meetings, little more than tokens of Islamic representation. And for the most part, contemporary Muslim writers on the environment have characterized environmental degradation as merely a symptom of social injustice. Although often participated in by Islamic nation-states, Foltz also notes that the contemporary global economy is un-Islamic. Its singular goal of maximizing profits for investors and speculators, leading to massive environmentally destructive developments and disproportionately benefiting wealthy elites rather than small-scale projects, which might be of more value to the truly needy. Between the Skula of modernization and the corruptus of fundamentalism, we can see the Islamic world as very much in the grips of contradictory pathways and demands, such as westernization and economic maximization, versus the simplicity of the life of the true Muslim as recommended by Muhammad and many Reformed traditions. According to Foltz, most Muslim environmentalism dismissed overpopulation as a non-issue. Global initiatives on birth control and women's reproductive rights are frequently dismissed. God will provide. Yet in Islamic law, there is no inherent barriers to practicing contraception. And Al-Ghazali, who we covered earlier in his book The Proper Conduct of Marriage, argues that the birth control in the form of coitus interruptus is permitted in Islam. Muslims can practice family planning following Islamic principles. It is a myth that Islamic doctrine opposes it. The principle of tawakkul, or trusting God, can be used by Muslims in both environmental and anti-environmental directions. It's often the response to any doomsday scenario propagated by Western environmentalists. They must be wrong, we must trust in God. Islam holds that the world is a passing phenomena created to serve God's purpose, which will cease to be once that purpose has been fulfilled. Whether the true essence of Islam is pro-environment or not, as in these environmental surahs and sayings in Muhammad, in practice, throughout most of its history, Muslim theologians, philosophers, and laypersons have focused almost exclusively on the relationship between Allah and humanity. And this anthropocentrism negates the claims of Islamic ecology. However, there are signs that recognition of environmental problems in Muslim societies is growing. The 1990s saw a proliferation of environmental non-governmental organizations throughout the Muslim world, as well as the establishment of environment ministries by the governments of various Muslim majority nations. It would seem that in the context of the world's many and diverse Muslim societies, a successful indigenous environmentalism would require a demonstrated compatibility with Islamic norms. Furthermore, in the face of so many problems and struggles facing the Islamic world, environmental protection often seems peripheral. The question for Foltz is how to best go about disseminating an Islamic environmental ethics as one part of the solution to our global environmental crises. Now, while there were some hopeful strands in the Foltz article, its coverage of conceptions of nature and spirit in the history of Islam was pretty thin, and its overall account of how Islam is doing in facing up to global environmental crises and overcoming inbuilt anthropocentrisms was a bit dim on the whole, and perhaps even a tiny bit pessimistic. In order to learn more and highlight the positive contributions of Islam on nature and spirit to contemporary world religions and ecological debates, I'd like now to turn to a leading Islamic scholar, Sayyid Nasir, and his 1994 Cadbury lectures, Religion and the Order of Nature. Nasir is an Iranian university professor of Islamic studies at George Washington University and a major Islamic philosopher. He's written on just about every subject and has been described as a polymath. Nasir's concern in the chapters I've assigned is nature and spirit not just in Islam, but in all the other world traditions as well. His writing can serve as a good overview of where we've been in this course so far and where we're going. We won't cover the whole of this chapter this week, but rather save his remarks on nature and spirit in Eastern traditions for when we cover those. But we will review Nasir on the order of nature in indigenous traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam at this point. You might already recognize and remember him from the Bill Moyer Spirit and Nature documentary. According to Nasir, our existential situation here on Earth leads us directly to the experience of order. Creation itself is envisaged in the most sacred cosmogonies as the imposition of order upon chaos, or we could say spirit upon nature. We can already see here Nasir's transcendental inflection. Spirit comes first and is of God, nature is secondary. In monotheism, nature is most often that which is other than God. Religions have sought to explain this order in religious terms, philosophers in philosophical ones, and more recently science according to the parameters of modern scientific thought. Some scientists have spoken of the emergence of order from chaos on the basis of spontaneous creativity. Across all areas of human knowledge and faith, inquiry into the order of nature continues to be of central significance to the world's traditions. This here begins from the definition of order in the Oxford English Dictionary, which has three meanings. 1, a formal disposition or any regular, methodical, or harmonious arrangement in the position of things contained in any space or area, or composing any group or body. 2, the condition in which everything is in its proper place and performs its proper function. And 3, a class, group, or kind or sort of persons, beings, or things having its rank in a scale of being, excellence, or importance, or distinguished from others by nature or character. More simply, there is order, the why of order, and the beings who are considered ordered or masterful. On order and nature in the indigenous religions, Nasir writes that despite great differences in myth and practice, there is a remarkable morphological resemblance as far as the relation to nature or the earth is concerned. Indigenous religions have always been guardians of the natural environment and of the messages coming from nature. Remember the Qur'anic teaching that there are 124,000 prophets and no nation to which a prophet has not come? It seems that it is in this light that Nasir approaches the indigenous religions. The environmental crisis we now face has invalidated cheap dismissal of indigenous religions and their teachings on order or spirit in nature. For Nasir, the core of the most ancient religious worldviews is shamanism, which we find not only in Asian but also North American traditions. It seems to have originated in Siberia, ancient Tibetan Po religion, Shintoism in Japan, to have made its way from there to North America. Like in Gloria Anzaldúa, who we studied last week, for Nasir as well, the basic structure of the shamanic universe is founded upon the 3 tiers of the cosmic tree or sacred mountain, Axis Mundi. And indigenous religions tend to believe in hylozoism, all matter is alive, and panpsychism, everything is ensouled. They are polytheistic with respect to the geography of the cosmic tree, which is a layered and nested cosmogony and usually a sky ladder. And the shaman is capable of journeying back and forth from the beyond of death through the use of this sky ladder and their encounter with the cosmic tree. Nasir notes there's often no clear separation between the sacred and nature in shamanism or indigenous religions, and no rationalist dissociation of the shaman from nature. Nasir points out how Shintoism, in fact, a shamanistic religion, and how it remains the foundation of Japanese society and culture. The word Shinto means the way of the kami, the gods, and is distinct from Butsudo, the way of the Buddha. Kami can mean both spirit and gods governing the world of nature and the soul and are responsible for harmony and order. And like shamanism, Shintoism distinguishes 3 planes of reality: the high heaven, the middle land, and the underworld. The history of Japan begins in heaven and proceeds by theophany in the middle and underworlds, and beauty is emphasized as mystical and as natural. According to Nasir, in Zen Buddhism and other offshoots influenced by Shintoism, we find unparalleled natural and spiritual beauty. More on these traditions in the coming weeks. North American indigenous traditions have survived despite the genocide and decimation wrought by colonialism. In North American traditions, spirit is at once transcendent and the immanent spirit in natural phenomena. Nature is sacred and an organic unity that we are a part of. In short, nature is a pure cathedral of spirit and its theophanies. The Ojibwe of British Columbia speak of a multi-layered flat earth and dominating spirits responsible for its order. According to them, the universe is alive and interconnected and governed by a spirit power which binds all things together. The Sioux speak of the Great Spirit, Wakantanka, who is God but also nature and who manifests its presence as Scan. As mentioned previously, Black Elk is the most famous exemplar of nature spirituality in the Sioux tradition and espouses a polysynthetic animism that is at the same time monotheistic. Nasir also covers African religions a little bit, noting they're very diverse but generally include animism, ancestor worship, sorcery, and a sky god, and that they've only begun to be carefully studied in the later half of the 20th century. Nasir considers the basic worldview of African religions to be similar to other indigenous ones. For the Bambara, the heart of esoteric teaching consists in mysteries surrounding the word, primal sound. When these vibrations double back on themselves in thought, consciousness is established. And the source of the structure of the universe is Yo, will or thought. Yo is also a silent word that speaks to all things. How to differentiate African religions from other indigenous traditions worldwide is also important, and Nasir doesn't go into that here. One of the major and difficult tasks is to understand which elements of contemporary African religions reflect the earliest religious viewpoints of humanity before the migrations out of Africa, and which are more recent developments in light of the development of religious consciousness across world history. These issues are difficult, but again, I recommend Witzel's The Origin of the World's Mythologies, which discusses many African religions and mythologies in terms of his hypothesis of a split between Laurasian and Gondwana mythological narratives, both Laurasian and Gondwana myths going back to an original Pan-Gaian mythology and religion characteristic of our earliest human ancestors. Next, Nasir touches on the Egyptian religions on spirit and nature. The Egyptian religion is indeed one of the world's most hieratic and immutable sacred tradition. All sacred land reflects a celestial archetype, and Egypt is made in the image of heaven. Egyptian thought made an indelible mark on the entire history of the West after it and still survives through Hermeticism. For the Egyptians, time, space, and forms are all ordered spiritually in nature. Isis is a nature and magic goddess, as is her husband, Osiris. The proper approach to nature and spirit is mythopoetic. Language or the word is spiritual or creative, but has an earthly aspect, which is the sign, sound, or phoneme, either pronounced or written in the hieroglyph. The order of the cosmos and of nature is sustained by a divinity, always in conflict with the forces of disorder. Seth is order, Horus, and the Egyptian word for nature is neter, or medu neturu, which Nasir understands as the idea from which objects are crystallized, or form, if we were to speak here with Aristotle. In the Egyptian way of thinking about other beings in nature, the bird's life world is an incarnation of its function as an idea. The bird's life world is its medu neturu, to which its nature or neter is accommodated. In this sense, neturu are the principles of nature and articulate the stages of its genesis and unfolding. On order and nature in the Abrahamic religions, Nasir notes that these are characterized by belief in a transcendent God who governs nature by wisdom and will, but also how there are important differences in their respective conceptions of nature. In Judaism, the Torah and Talmud most define nature. Whether Genesis 1 describes a creation ex nihilo or creation from pre-existing elements is still debated, as we saw in week 4. In Kabbalism, the 10 Sephiroth can be considered as natural principles of cosmic order, also discussed in week 4. The very substance of the cosmos is related to the coagulation of a reality that ultimately belongs to divine order, from Ein Sof to Shekinah. For Nasir, the Kabbalists, as well as the followers of medieval Hasidism, were fully aware that all the order of this world derives from archetypal realities. And as in Christianity and Islam, most practitioners of Judaism accept a more simplified notion of nature based on morality and the will of God. But this is not the deeper notion of nature that we actually find when we study scripture, as well as the mystical traditions which tend to think more deeply about nature. On Christianity and nature, Nasir begins from the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, Logos, or harmony. The Logos is the incarnation. It is by the Word that all things were made, and thus Christ becomes the axis mundi. Early Christians believed that demons lived within the earth and are conquered by Christ. We saw this in the Juliette Boulay material on life in a Greek Orthodox village. Early Christians also believed in pneuma, the Spirit of the Lord hath filled the whole world. And in Augustine, spirit becomes defined as the ordering and formative power of all things. Quote from Augustine, "As the creative will of a sculptor hovers over a piece of wool, or the spiritual soul spreads through all the limbs of the body, thus it is with the Holy Ghost. It hovers over all things with a creative and formative power." For Augustine, the whole of the world in its infinite variety thus becomes divine creation. For Augustine, nature, natura, means nothing else than that which anything is conceived of as being in its own kind, and every nature, as far as it is nature, is good. Augustine thus rejected Aristotelian naturalism and saw the end of the world as being beyond nature and order in nature as issuing from beyond nature. All of nature in this way becomes natura naturata, natured by God, rather than strictly natura naturans, or self-engendering nature, as it was in pagan and Greek thought. Nasir goes on Augustine's especial sensitivity to the challenge of Manichaean doctrines. The world is not defined by good versus evil or chaos versus order, but rather by a creation ex nihilo, an omnigod who creates the world and sets up its nature. God created the world because he is the good, and it is in the nature of the good to give and generate beyond itself. Moreover, God produced the world according to number, as Augustine quotes from Isaiah, "And thou hast ordered all things in measure and number and weight," as we read in the Psalm of Wisdom. For Augustine, in the beginning, in principio, God made the heaven and the earth, and this means not in time, but in the Logos and instantly, including the heavens, the angels, the earth, and the material formlessness corresponding to the boundless waters. Idea or reason is from God, as are the essences which inform all particular things. Lastly, evil was only evil of sin in Adam, and in its propagation down to our own day, it became the evil of nature. Vicious nature took the place of a good nature henceforth. As we've seen, this gave rise to the mainstream Catholic and Protestant views on nature, which, despite dissenting voices, largely maintained that nature is a fallen realm. Nasir, like other writers we've studied, points to Eastern Orthodox theology as following a different path, especially in Saint Maximus the Confessor, who was martyred in 662 and influenced by Dionysius the Areopagite. In Saint Maximus, the categories of order and nature denote God's active care for creation. Logos involves conformity with divine will and intentions and establishes a living relationship with God. So basically, there's no logos from God for humanity without engagement with nature in the way God intended. Saint Maximus also emphasized that creation is not only an act of the Father, but of all the Trinity. So there's an infinite creativity in the Holy Ghost as well as in Jesus. Logos is not only Christ's incarnation, but is the Christ in all things. Reality is thus incarnational, sacred, and sacramental. And all of nature as God's creation possesses its telos, or its end in God. These orthodox positions in Maximus the Confessor sound a fair bit like Sally McFaig, no? We'll be covering Maximus more in week 12 when we look to Brutes Faults, the Noetics of Nature. Nasir also helpfully reviews the theme of spirituality and creativity in Hildegarda, recall Viriditas. On spirit and nature, or order and nature in Christianity, Nasir concludes, it was this vision of the order of nature as both the natural order and the origin of order in nature that was to be challenged in the later history of Western thought, bringing about that radical transformation of the understanding and of the meaning of order whose consequences are everywhere visible in the present environmental crisis. In other words, the real culprit for our environmental crisis in Nasir is, like in Northcott, the reductive scientific or applied scientific explanation and ordering of nature on the part of human beings, not really an inheritance from Christianity as such, but rather the specific way that Christianity utilized Greek reason, logic, and science. And yet for centuries, Christians have repeated in the Mass, "Holy, holy, Lord God of hosts, heaven and earth are full of his glory," and continue to do so even today, using the text taken from the prophet Isaiah's vision of the seraphim encircling the divine throne. For Nasir, Christians continue to attest to the wedding festival of heaven and earth and bear witness to God's glory, despite the eclipse of this perspective in much of Western civilization and its loss in secular culture. When we return to authentic Christianity, by necessity, we discover the order of nature from the divine and as the sacred. Well, thanks, Nasir. That was a very helpful review of where we've been in the course so far and where we're going. Lastly, for this week, we'll be covering his views on Islam and the order of nature. Islam, like Christianity and Judaism, was also greatly influenced by Greco-Alexandrian antiquity. When the Christian Dark Ages were beginning, however, this was precisely the beginning of the Islamic Golden Age and the amassment of a vast scientific tradition. The Islamic science of nature in this way played a crucial role in the history of Western science. However, Islam, heir like Judaism and Christianity to the spiritual universe of Abraham, did not reject its religious understanding of the order of nature while cultivating the natural sciences. And it has not done so to a large extent even today, despite the spread of modernism into the Islamic world during the past century. So Nasir, rooting himself in classical Islam and its philosophy of nature, notes that some elements of Islamic reform and revival are a good thing, very deeply rooted in faith, as well as in deep traditions of scientific thinking about nature. The Quranic perspective on order in nature is this: divine wisdom from the prototype of all existence, or Allah becoming divine order in the world. And he notes how in the first Quranic verse and throughout Quranic thinking, the pen is so central and important. For the pen is an active principle of creation, a way of accessing the very creativity of God as it was laid down within Allah in the guarded tablet, or the cosmogonic charter for the universe. Nasir next points to the concept of measure as central in the Qur'an. Everything with him has its measure, miqdar. Miqdar is related to Qudra, power. God, as the all-powerful Al-Qadir, has determined the measure of all creation. And elsewhere in the Quran, nature is described as the night of power. According to Nasir, the very power that created the world of nature and revealed the Quran is therefore the origin of the order and harmony perceived throughout creation. The very act of the creation of nature by Allah implies an order inseparable from the creative power that has created the universe. The measure of nature given by Allah is given by His hand, in which we find the dominion, malakut, of all things. According to Nasir, this Quranic verse implies that nature is not an independent domain of reality with its own independent order, but that its principle resides in another realm of reality, which is divine. According to the Quranic concept of nature, it is basically the proof of God's existence, as well as His wisdom and power. On the subject of spirit in Islam, Nasir points out the significance of the 99 names and divine qualities of Allah, and quotes Ibn Arabi, "There is no property in the cosmos without a divine support and a lordly attribute. The divine names are themselves the principles of the immutable archetypes. Furthermore, God breathes upon these archetypes, and thus the cosmos comes into being. God's breath here being the Islamic origin of spirit. The very substance of the cosmos is the breath of the compassionate, and nature as created within creation is respirational. This rich conception of spirit as breath in Islam accounts for why traditional Islamic cosmology is filled with angels and jinni, psychic beings mentioned explicitly in the Quran, as well as stars and mountains, the plants and animals, and finally human beings. Within Allah's breath, as all natural created spirit, all beings are interconnected in a spiritual ecology. On Islam and angelology, Nasir writes, Islamic cosmology, like other traditional cosmologies, is inseparable from angelology on both the intellectual level and in the everyday life of believers. The presence of these hosts of non-material beings, that is, the presence of the spirit world, is constant. For the observant Muslim, the angels doing everything they do by duty or submission. In a way, the angels themselves are the best Muslims. Help to teach Allah's spiritual order to man, so that ultimately the human being as well can return to the supreme divine principle. On Sharia law or divine law, Nasir is clear that it doesn't only govern Islamic society but applies to other creatures. All beings in nature except human beings follow divine law and exist in perfect obedience and submission to God without deviation. Furthermore, the Sunnah of Allah is for all creatures, and there is no dichotomy between moral laws governing human beings and natural laws. For Nasir, this is the essence of Sharia law as both natural and divine. Nasir concludes that traditional religions agree that the reality of nature has a significance beyond its appearance and that there is a sacred quality within nature. And second, they all agree that the order of nature has a purpose, a meaning, and this meaning has spiritual and moral significance for human beings. This is what distinguishes the religious approach to nature, as opposed to, say, contemporary secular approaches such as, improperly understood, the Gaia hypothesis, which we'll look at in week 13. Third, all the religions seem to agree for Nasir that the human and natural orders are intertwined in a bi-unity, in such a way that their destinies are interrelated, not only here and now, but even in the ultimate state that is eschatological or beyond this life. Fourth, the laws of man and the laws of nature are not totally distinct, but are again closely interrelated and in some traditions the same. So interestingly, Nasir here thinks of Sharia law or al-Sharia and Sunnah in the context of the Tao or the way, duty, justice, and order or balance. And finally, understood aright, all the world's religions agree that earth is man's teacher and man can learn from the order of nature not only quantitatively, but also morally, intellectually, and spiritually. Note how Nasir's reading is inflected throughout by Islam. Spirit or God still comes first and is transcendent, and the creative source of nature, and yet nature is thoroughly spiritualized. Whether we want to admit it or not, recognizable first of all and above all in the order of nature. For Nasir, the greatest contribution of the Islamic philosophy of nature is its cosmologia perennis or perennial cosmology, a trait which the meditation on nature in Islam shares with Christianity, the universal heritage of the religious view of the order of nature, which is in a sense an aspect of what we might call cosmologia perennis, was to be challenged by modern Western philosophy and science and replaced by another view of nature divorced both from man's final end and the divine principle, a view that, having undergone its incubation and growth in the West, has now spread over much of the globe and has resulted in a crisis of unprecedented proportions for both human life and the natural environment. I hope you've enjoyed your overview of Islam and the themes of spirit and nature in Islam. And I look forward to beginning on the Eastern traditions on spirit and nature with you next week. Have a good week.